and welcome back to the Reading Corner. I'm your host, Renee, and I am here for you every Wednesday reading stories from the public domain. With the exception of December, this is number 2 of 3 for December uploads, because I'm taking a break for the holidays. But without further ado, let's get into it. Chapter 16. The barber makes another attempt to sell the string of pearls. It would seem as if Sweeny Todd, after his adventure in already trying to dispose of the string of pearls which he possessed, began to feel a little doubtful about his chances of success in that matter. For he waited patiently for a considerable period before he again made the attempt, and then he made it after a totally different fashion. Towards the close of the night on that same evening, when Joanna Oakley had met Colonel Geoffrey for the second time in the Temple Garden, and while Tobais sat alone in the shop in his usual deep dejection, a stranger entered the place with a large blue bag in his hand and looked inquiringly about him.
"Halloa, my lad," said he. "Is this Mr. Todd's?"
"Yes," said Tobais, "but he is not at home. What do you want?"
"Well, I'll be hanged," said the man, "if this don't beat everything. You don't mean to tell me he is a barber, do you?"
"Indeed I do. Don't you see?"
"Yes, I see, to be sure, but I'll be shot if I thought of it beforehand. What do you think he has been doing?"
"Doing?" said Tobais with animation. "Do you think he will be hanged?"
"Why, no, I don't say it's a hanging matter, although you seem as if you wished it was. But I'll just tell you now, we are artists at the west end of the town."
"Artists? Do you mean to say you draw pictures?"
No, we make clothes, but we call ourselves artists now because tailors are out of fashion."
"Oh, that's it, is it?"
"Yes, that's it. And you would scarcely believe it, but he came to our shop actually and ordered a suit of clothes, which were to come to no less a sum than £30, and told us to make them up in such a style that they were to do for any nobleman, and he gave his name and address as Mr. Todd, at this number in Fleet Street. But I hadn't the least idea that he was a barber. If I had, I am quite certain the clothes would not have been finished in the style they are, but quite the reverse."
"Well," said Tobais, "I can't think what he wants such clothing for, but I suppose it's all right. Was he a tall, ugly-looking fella?"
"As ugly as the very devil. I'll just show you the things, as he is not at home. The coat is of the finest velvet, lined with silk, and trimmed with lace. Did you ever in all your life see such a coat for a barber?"
"Indeed I never did, but it is some scheme of his, of course. It is a superb coat."
"Yes, and all the rest of the dress is of the same style. What on earth can he be going to do with it? I can't think, for it's only fit to go to court in."
"Oh, well, I know nothing about it," said Tobais with a sigh. "You can leave it or not, as you like. It's all one to me."
"Well, you do seem the most melancholy wretch ever I came near. What's the matter with you?"
"The matter with me? Oh, nothing. Of course, I'm as happy as I can be. Ain't I Sweeny Todd's apprentice? And ain't that enough to make anybody sing all day long?"
"It may be, for all I know, but certainly you don't seem to be in a singing humour. But however, we artists cannot waste our time, so just be so good as to take care of the clothes, and be sure you give them to your master, and so I wash my hands of this transaction."
Very good. Very good. He shall have them. But do you mean to leave such valuable clothes without getting the money for them?"
"No, not exactly, for they are paid for."
"Oh, that makes all the difference. He shall have them, then." Scarcely had this tailor left the place when a boy arrived with a parcel, and looking around him with undisguised astonishment, said, "Isn't there some other Mr. Todd in Fleet Street?" "Not that I know of," said Tobais. "What have you got there?" Silk stockings, gloves, lace, cravats, ruffles, so on. The deuce you have! I dare say it's all right. I shall leave 'em. They're paid for. This is the name and this is the number. Now, stupid! This last exclamation arose from the fact that this boy, in going out, ran up against another who was coming in. Can't you see where you're going? Said the new arrival. What's that to you? I've a good mind to punch your head. Do it, and then come down our court and see what licking I give you. Will you? Why don't you? Only let me catch you, that's all. They stood for some moments so closely together that their noses very nearly touched, and then, after mutual assertions of what they would do if they caught each other, although in either case to stretch out an arm would have been quite sufficient to have accomplished the object, they separated, and the last comer said to Tobais in a tone of irritation, probably consequent upon the misunderstanding he had just had with the hosier's boy, You can tell Mr. Todd that the carriage will be ready at 7:30 precisely. And then he went away, leaving Tobais in a state of great bewilderment as to what Sweeny Todd could possibly be about to do with such an amount of finery as that which was evidently coming home for him. I can't make it out, he said. It's some villainy, of course, but I can't make out what it is. I wish I knew. I might thwart him in it. He is a villain, and neither could nor would project anything good. But what can I do? I'm quite helpless in all this, and we'll just have to let it take its course. I can only wish for a power of action I shall never possess. Alas, I'm very sad, and know not what will become of me. I wish that I was in my grave, and there I am sure I shall be soon, unless something happens to turn the tide of all this wretched evil fortune that's come upon me. It was in vain for Tobais to think of vexing himself with conjectures as to what Sweeny Todd was about to do with so much finery, for he had not the remotest foundation to go upon in the matter, and could not for the life of him imagine any possible contingency or chance which should make it necessary for the barber to deck himself in such gaudy apparel. All he could do was to lay down in his own mind a general principle as regarded Sweeny Todd's conduct, and that consisted in the fact that whatever might be his plans and whatever might be his objects, they were for no good purpose, but, on the contrary, were most certainly intended for the accomplishment of some great evil which that most villainous person intended to perpetrate. I will observe all I can, thought Tobais to himself, and do what I can to put a stop to his mischiefs, but I fear it will be very little he will allow me to observe, and perhaps still less that he will allow me to do. But I can try, and do my best. Poor Tobias's best, as regarded achieving anything against Sweeny Todd, we may well suppose would be little indeed, for that individual was not the man to give anybody an opportunity of doing much, and possessed as he was of the most consummate art, as well as the greatest possible amount of unscrupulousness, there can be very little doubt but that any attempt poor Tobais might make would recoil upon himself. In about half an hour the barber returned, and his first question was, Have any things been left for me? Yes, sir, said Tobais. Here are 2 parcels, and a boy has been to say that the carriage will be ready at 7:30 precisely. 'Tis well, said the barber. That will do. And Tobais, you will be careful whilst I am gone of the shop. I shall be back in half an hour, mind you, and not later. And be sure that I find you here at your post. But you may say, if anyone comes here on business, there will be neither shavings nor dressings tonight. You understand me? Yes, sir, certainly. Sweeny Todd then took the bundles which contained the costly apparel, and retired into the parlour with them. And as it was then 7 o'clock, Tobais correctly enough supposed that he had gone to dress himself. And he waited with a considerable amount of curiosity to see what sort of an appearance the barber would cut in his fine apparel. Tobais had not to control his impatience long, for in less than 20 minutes out came Sweeny Todd, attired in the very height of fashion for the period. His waistcoat was something positively gorgeous, and his fingers were loaded with such costly rings that they quite dazzled the sight of Tobais to look upon. Then, moreover, he wore a sword with a jewelled hilt, but it was one which Tobais really thought he had seen before, for he had a recollection that a gentleman had come to have his hair dressed and had taken it off, and laid just such a sword across his hat during the operation. "Remember," said Sweeny Todd, "remember your instructions. Obey them to the letter, and no doubt you will ultimately become happy and independent." With these words, Sweeny Todd left the place, and poor Tobais looked after him with a groan as he repeated the words. "Happy and independent! Alas, what a mockery it is of this man to speak to me in such a way! I only wish that I were dead." But we will leave Tobais to his own reflections, and follow the more interesting progress of Sweeny Todd, who, for some reason best known to himself, was then playing so grand a part and casting away so large a sum of money. He made his way to a livery stables in the immediate neighbourhood, and there, sure enough, the horses were being placed to a handsome carriage. And all being very soon in readiness, Sweeny Todd gave some whispered directions to the driver, and the vehicle started off westward. At that time, Hyde Park Corner was very nearly out of town, and it looked as if you were getting a glimpse of the country and actually seeing something of the peasantry of England when you got another couple of miles off, and that was the direction in which Sweeny Todd went. And as he goes, we may as well introduce to the reader the sort of individual whom he was going to visit in so much state, and for whom he thought it necessary to go to such great expense. At that period, the follies and vices of the nobility were somewhere about as great as they are now, and consequently extravagance induced on many occasions troublesome sacrifice of money. And it was found extremely convenient to apply to a man of the name of John Mundell, an exceedingly wealthy person, a Dutchman by extraction, who was reported to make immense sums of money by lending to the nobility and others what they required on emergencies at enormous rates of interest. But it must not be supposed that John Mundell was so confiding as to lend his money without security. It was quite the reverse, for he took care to have the jewels, some costly plate, or the title deeds of an estate perchance, as security, before he would part with a single shilling of his cash. In point of fact, John Mundell was nothing more than a pawnbroker on a very extensive scale. And although he had an office in town, he usually received his more aristocratic customers at his private residence, which was about 2 miles off on the Uxbridge Road. After this explanation, it can very easily be imagined what was the scheme of Sweeny Todd, and that he considered if he borrowed from John Mundell a sum equal in amount to half the real value of the pearls, he should be well rid of a property which he certainly could not sufficiently well account for the possession of, to enable him to dispose of it openly to the highest bidder. We give Sweeny Todd great credit for the scheme he proposed. It was eminently calculated to succeed, and one which, in the way he undertook it, was certainly set about in the best way possible. During his ride, he revolved in his mind exactly what he should say to John Mundell, and from what we know of him, we may be well convinced that Sweeny Todd was not likely to fail from any amount of bashfulness in the transaction, but that, on the contrary, he was just the man to succeed in any scheme which required great assurance to carry it through. For he was most certainly master of great assurance, and possessed a kind of diplomatic skill, which, had fortune placed him in a more elevated position of life, would no doubt have made a great man of him, and gained him great political reputation. John Mundell's villa, which was called, by the by, Mundell House, was a large, handsome, and modern structure surrounded by a few acres of pleasure gardens, which, however, the moneylender never looked at, for his whole soul was too much engrossed by his love for cash to enable him to do so, and if he derived any satisfaction at all from it, that satisfaction must have been entirely owing to the fact that he had wrung mansions, grounds, and all the costly furnishings of the former from an improvident debtor, who had been forced to fly from the country and leave his property wholly in the hands of the moneylender and assurer. It was but a short drive with the really handsome horses that Sweeny Todd had succeeded in hiring for the occasion, and he soon found himself opposite the entrance gates of the residence of John Mundle. His great object now was that the usurer should see the equipage which he had brought down, and he accordingly desired the footman who accompanied him at once to ring the bell at the entrance gate, and to say that a gentleman was waiting in his carriage to see Mr. Mundle. This was done, and when the moneylender's servant reported to him that the equipage was a costly one, and that in his opinion the visitor must be some nobleman of great rank, John Mundle made no difficulty about the matter, but walked down to the gate at once, where he immediately mentally subscribed to the opinion of his servant, by admitting to himself that the equipage was faultless, and presumed at once that it did belong to some person of great rank. He was proportionately humble, as such men always are, and advancing to the side of the carriage, he begged to know what commands his lordship, for so he called him at once, had for him. "I wish to know," said Sweeny Todd, "Mr. Mundle, if you are inclined to lay under an obligation a rather illustrious lady, by helping her out of a little pecuniary difficulty." John Mundle glanced again at the equipage, and he likewise saw something of the rich dress of his visitor, who had not disputed the title which had been applied to him of lord, and he made up his mind accordingly that it was just one of the transactions that would suit him, provided the security that would be offered was of a tangible nature. That was the only point upon which John Mundle had the remotest doubt. But, at all events, he urgently pressed his visitor to alight and walk in. Chapter 17. The Great Change in the Prospects of Sweeny Todd. As Sweeny Todd's object, as far as regarded the money-lender's having seen the carriage, was fully answered, he had no objection to enter the house, which he accordingly did at once, being preceded by John Mundle, who became each moment more and more impressed with the fact, as he considered it, that his guest was some person of very great rank and importance in society. He ushered him into a splendidly furnished apartment, and after offering him refreshments, which Sweeny Todd politely declined, he waited with no small degree of impatience for his visitors to be more explicit with regard to the object of his visit. "I should," said Sweeny Todd, "have myself accommodated the illustrious lady with the sum of money she requires, but as I could not do so without encumbering some estates, she positively forbade me to think of it." "Certainly," said Mr. Mundle. "She is a very illustrious lady, I presume?" "Very illustrious indeed, but it must be a condition of this transaction, if you at all enter into it, that you are not to inquire precisely who she is, nor are you to inquire precisely who I am." "It's not my usual way of conducting business. But if everything else be satisfactory, I shall not cavil at that." "Very good. By everything else being satisfactory, I presume you mean the security offered." "Why, yes, that is of great importance, my lord." "I informed the illustrious lady that as the affair was to be wrapped up in something of a mystery, the security must be extremely ample." "That's a very proper view to take of the matter, my lord." "I wonder," thought John Mundle, "if he is a duke, I shall call him your grace next time, and see if he objects." "Therefore," continued Sweeny Todd, "the illustrious lady placed in my hands security to a third greater amount than she required." "Certainly, certainly. A very proper arrangement, your grace. May I ask the name of the proffered security?" "Jewels." "Highly satisfactory and unexceptionable security. They go into a small space, and do not deteriorate in value." "And if they do," said the barber, "deteriorate in value, it would make no difference to you, for the illustrious person's honour would be committed to your redemption." "I don't doubt that, your grace, in the least. I merely make the remark incidentally, quite incidentally." Of course. And I trust, before going further, that you are quite in a position to enter into this subject?" "Certainly I am, and I am proud to say to any amount. Show me the money's worth, your grace, and I will show you the money. That's my way of doing business, and no one can say that John Mundle ever shrunk from a matter that was brought fairly before him, and that he considered worth his going into. It was by hearing such a character of you that I was induced to come to you. What do you think of that?" Sweeny Todd took from his pocket with a careless air the string of pearls, and cast them down before the eyes of the moneylender, who took them up and ran them rapidly through his fingers for a few seconds before he said, "I thought there was but one string like this in the kingdom, and those belong to the Queen." "Well," said Sweeny Todd, "I humbly beg your grace's pardon. How much money does your grace require on these pearls?" £12,000 is their current value. If a sale of them was enforced, £8,000 are required of you on their security." "8,000 is a large sum. As a general thing, I lend but half the value upon anything. But in this case, to oblige your grace and the illustrious personage, I do not, of course, hesitate for one moment, but shall, for 1 month, lend you the required amount." "That will do," said Sweeny Todd, scarcely concealing the exultation he felt at getting so much more from John Mundle than he expected, and which he certainly would not have got if the moneylender had not been most fully and completely impressed with the idea that the pearls belonged to the Queen, and that he had actually at length Majesty itself for a customer. He did not suppose for one moment that it was the Queen who wanted the money, but his view of the case was that she had lent the pearls to this nobleman to meet some exigency of his own, and that, of course, they would be redeemed very shortly. Altogether, a more pleasant transaction for John Mundle could not have been imagined. It was just the sort of thing he would have looked out for, and had the greatest satisfaction in bringing to a conclusion. And he considered it was opening the door to the highest class of business in his way that he was capable of doing. "In what name, your grace," he said, "shall I draw a cheque upon my banker?" "In the name of Colonel George." "Certainly. And if your grace will give me an acknowledgment for £8,000, and please to understand that at the end of a month from this time the transaction will be renewed if necessary, I will give you a cheque for £7,500. "Why £7,500 only, when you mentioned £8,000? "The £500 is my little commission upon the transaction. Your grace will perceive that I appreciate highly the honour of your grace's custom, and consequently charge the lowest possible price. I can assure your grace I could get more for my money by a great deal, but the pleasure of being able to meet your grace's view is so great that I am willing to make a sacrifice, and therefore it is that I say 500 when I really ought to say £1,000, taking into consideration the great scarcity of money at the present juncture, and I can assure your grace that—" "Peace, peace," said Sweeny Todd. "And if it be not convenient to redeem the jewels at the end of the month from this time, you will hear from me most assuredly." "I am quite satisfied of that," said John Mundle, and he accordingly drew a cheque for £7,500, which he handed to Sweeny Todd, who put it in his pocket, not a little delighted that at last he had got rid of his pearls, even at a price so far beneath their real value. "I need scarcely urge upon you, Mr. Mundle," he said, "the propriety of keeping this affair profoundly secret." "Indeed you need not, your grace, for it is part of my business to be discreet and cautious. I should very soon have nothing to do in my line, your grace may depend, if I were to talk about it. No, this transaction will forever remain locked up in my own breast, and no living soul but your grace and I need know what occurred." With this, John Mundle showed Sweeny Todd to his carriage with abundance of respect, and in 2 minutes more he was travelling along toward town with what might be considered a small fortune in his pocket. We should have noticed earlier that Sweeny Todd had, upon the occasion of his going to sell the pearls to the lapidary in the city, made some great alterations to his appearance, so that it was not likely he should be recognized again to a positive certainty. For example, having no whiskers whatever of his own, he had put on a large black pair of false ones, as well as mustachios, and he had given some colour to his cheeks likewise, which had so completely altered his appearance that those who were most intimate with him would not have known him except by his voice, and that he took good care to alter in his intercourse with John Mundle, so that it should not become a future means of detection. "I thought that this would succeed," he muttered to himself as he went towards town, "and I have not been deceived. For 3 months longer, and only 3, I will carry on the business in Fleet Street, so that any sudden alterations in my fortunes may not give rise to suspicion." He was then silent for some minutes, during which he appeared to be revolving some very knotty question in his brain, and then he said suddenly, "Well, well, as regards Tobais, I think it will be safer, unquestionably, to put him out of the way by taking his life than to try to dispose of him in a madhouse. And I think there are 1 or 2 more persons whom it will be highly necessary to prevent being mischievous. At all events at present. I must think. When such a man as Sweeny Todd sets about thinking, there could be no possible doubt but that some serious mischief was meditated, and anyone who could have watched his face during that ride home from the money-lenders would have seen by its expression that the thoughts which agitated him were of a dark and desperate character, and such as anybody but himself would have shrunk from aghast. But he was not a man to shrink from anything, and, on the contrary, the more a set of circumstances presented themselves in a gloomy and terrific aspect, the better they seemed to suit him, and the peculiar constitution of his mind. There could be no doubt but that the love of money was the predominant feeling in Sweeny Todd's intellectual organization, and that, by the amount it would bring him, or the amount it would deprive him of, he measured everything. With such a man, then, no question of morality or ordinary feeling could arise, and there can be no doubt that he would quite willingly have sacrificed the whole human race, if, by so doing, he could have achieved any of the objects of his ambition. And so, on his road homeward, he probably made up his mind to plunge still deeper into criminality, and perchance to indulge in acts that a man not already so deeply versed in iniquity would have shrunk from with the most positive terror. And by a strange style of reasoning, such men as Sweeny Todd reconcile themselves to the most heinous crimes upon the grounds of what they call policy. That is to say, that having committed some serious offense, they are compelled to commit a great number more, for the purpose of endeavoring to avoid the consequences of the first lot. and hence the continuance of criminality becomes a matter necessary to self-defense, and an essential ingredient in their consideration of self-preservation. Probably Sweeny Todd had been for the greater part of his life aiming at the possession of extensive pecuniary resources, and, no doubt, by the aid of a superior intellect and a mind full of craft and design, he had managed to make others subservient to his views. And now that those views were answered, and that his underlings and accomplices were no longer required, they became positively dangerous. He was well aware of that cold-blooded policy which teaches that it is far safer to destroy than to cast away the tools by which a man carves his way to power and fortune. "They shall die," said Sweeny Todd. "Dead men tell no tales, nor women, nor boys either, and they shall all die. After which there will be, I think, a serious fire in Fleet Street. Ha ha! It may spread to what mischief it likes, always provided it stops not short of the entire destruction of my house and premises. Rare sport will it be to me, for then I will at once commence a new career, in which the barber will be forgotten, and the man of fashion only seen and remembered, for with this last addition to my means, I am fully capable of vying with the highest and the noblest, let them be who they may." This seemed a pleasant train of reflections to Sweeny Todd, and as the coach entered Fleet Street there sat such a grim smile upon his countenance that he looked like some fiend in human shape, who had just completed the destruction of a human soul. When he reached the livery stables, to which he directed them to drive, instead of his own shop, he rewarded all who had gone with him most liberally, so that the coachman and footman, who were both servants out of place, would have had no objection for Sweeny Todd every day to have gone on some such expedition, so that they should receive as liberal wages for the small part they enacted in it as they did upon that occasion. He then walked from the stables toward his own house, but upon reaching there a little disappointment awaited him, for he found, to his surprise, that no light was burning, and when he placed his hand upon the shop door, it opened, but there was no trace of Tobais, although he, Sweeny Todd, called loudly upon him the moment he set foot within the shop. Then a feeling of apprehension crept across the barber, and he groped anxiously about for some matches, by the aid of which he hoped to procure a light, and then an explanation of the mysterious absence of Tobais. But in order that we may, in its proper form, relate how it was that Tobais had had the daring, thus in open contradiction of his master, to be away from the shop, we must devote to Tobais a chapter, which will plead his extenuation. Chapter 18. Tobias's Adventures During the Absence of Sweeny Todd. Tobais guessed, and guessed rightly too, that when Sweeny Todd said he would be away half an hour, he only mentioned that short period of time in order to keep the lad's vigilance on the alert, and to prevent him from taking any advantage of a more protracted absence. The very style and manner in which he had gone out precluded the likelihood of it being for so short a period of time, and that circumstance set Tobais seriously thinking over a situation which was becoming more intolerable every day. The lad had the sense to feel that he could not go on much longer as he was going on, and that in a short time such a life would destroy him. "It is beyond endurance," he said, "and I know not what to do. And since Sweeny Todd has told me that the boy he had before went out of his senses, and is now in a cell of a madhouse, I feel that such will be my fate, and that I too shall come to that dreadful end, and then no one will believe a word I utter, but consider everything to be mere ravings." After a time, as the darkness increased, he lit the lamp which hung in the shop, and which, until it was closed for the night, usually shed a dim ray from the window. Then he sat down to think again, and he said to himself, "If I could now but summon courage to ask my mother about this robbery which Sweeny Todd imputes to her, she might assure me it was false, and that she never did such a deed. But then it is dreadful for me to ask her such a question, because it may be true, And then how shocking it would be for her to be forced to confess to me her own son such a circumstance. These were the honourable feelings which prevented Tobais from questioning his mother as regarded Todd's accusation of her. An accusation too dreadful to believe implicitly, and yet sufficiently probable for him to have a strong suspicion that it might be true after all. It is to be deeply regretted that Tobias's philosophy did not carry him a little further and make him see, the moment the charge was made, that he ought unquestionably to investigate it to the very utmost. But still we could hardly expect from a mere boy that acute reasoning and power of action, which depends so much upon the knowledge of the world and an extensive practice in the usages of society. It was sufficient if he felt correctly. We could scarcely expect him to reason so. But upon this occasion, above all others, he seemed completely overcome by the circumstances which surrounded him. And from his excited manner one might have almost imagined that the insanity he himself predicted at the close of his career was really not far off. He wrung his hands and he wept, every now and then in sad speech, bitterly bemoaning his situation, until at length, with a sudden resolution, he sprang to his feet, exclaiming, "This night shall end it! I can endure it no more! I will fly from this place and seek my fortune elsewhere. Any amount of distress, danger, or death itself even, is preferable to the dreadful life I lead." He walked some paces toward the door, and then he paused, as he said to himself in a low tone, "Todd will surely not be home yet a while, and why should I then neglect the only opportunity I may ever have of searching this house to satisfy my mind as regards any of the mysteries that it contains?" He paused over this thought and considered well its danger, for dangerous indeed it was to no small extent. But he was desperate, and with a resolution that scarcely could have been expected from him, he determined upon taking that first step, above all others, which Todd was almost certain to punish with death. He closed the shop door, and bolted it upon the inside, so that he could not be suddenly interrupted, and then he looked round him carefully for some weapon, by the aid of which he should be able to break his way into the parlour, which the barber always kept closed and locked in his absence. A weapon that would answer the purpose of breaking any lock if he, Tobais, chose to proceed so roughly to work, was close at hand in the iron bar which, when the place was closed at night, secured a shutter to the door. Wrought up as he was to almost frenzy, Tobais seized the bar, and advancing toward the parlour door, he with one blow smashed the lock to atoms, and the door yielded. The moment it did so, there was a crash of glass, and when Tobais entered the room, he saw that upon its threshold lay a wine-glass shattered to atoms, and he felt certain that it had been placed in some artful position by Sweeny Todd as a detector, when he should return, of any attempt that had been made upon the door of the parlour. And now Tobais felt that he was so far committed that he might as well go on with his work, and accordingly he lit a candle, which he found upon the parlour table, and then proceeded to make what discoveries he could. Several of the cupboards in the room yielded at once to his hand, and in them he found nothing remarkable, but there was one that he could not open, so, without a moment's hesitation, he had recourse to the bar of iron again, and broke its lock, when the door swung open, and to his astonishment there tumbled out of this cupboard such a volley of hats of all sorts and descriptions, some looped with silver, some three-cornered, and some square, that they formed quite a museum of that article of attire, and excited the greatest surprise in the mind of Tobais, at the same time that they tended very greatly to confirm some other thoughts and feelings which he had concerning Sweeny Todd. This was the only cupboard which was fast, although there was another door which looked as if it opened into one. But when Tobais broke that door with the bar of iron, he found it was the door which led to the staircase conducting to the upper part of the house. That upper part which Sweeny Todd, with all his avarice, would never let, and of which the shutters were kept continually closed, so that the opposite neighbours never caught a glimpse into any of the apartments. With cautious and slow steps, which he adopted instantaneously, although he knew that there was no one in the house but himself, Tobais ascended the staircase. "I will go to the very top rooms first," he said to himself, "and so examine them all as I come down, and then if Todd should return suddenly, I shall have a better chance of hearing him than if I began below and went upward." Acting upon this prudent scheme, he went up to the attics, all the doors of which were swinging open, and there was nothing in any of them whatever. He descended to the second floor with the like result, and a feeling of great disappointment began to creep over him at the thought that after all the barber's house might not repay the trouble of examination. But when he reached the first floor, he soon found abundant reason to alter his opinion. The doors were fast, and he had to burst them open, and when he got in, he found that those rooms were partially furnished, and that they contained a great quantity of miscellaneous property of all kinds and descriptions. In one corner was an enormous quantity of walking sticks, some of which were of a very costly and expensive character, with gold and silver chased tops to them. And in another corner was a great number of umbrellas, in fact, at least 100 of them. Then there were boots and shoes lying upon the floor, partially covered up as if to keep them from dirt. There were 30 or 40 swords of different styles and patterns, many of them appearing to be very firm blades, and in 1 or 2 cases the scabbards were richly ornamented. At one end of the front and larger of these 2 rooms was an old-fashioned-looking bureau of great size, and with as much woodwork in it as seemed required to make at least a couple of such articles of furniture. This was very securely locked, and presented more difficulties in the way of opening it than any of the doors had done, for the lock was of great strength and apparent durability. Moreover, it was not so easily got at. But at length, by using the bar as a sort of lever instead of as a mere machine to strike with, Tobais succeeded in forcing this bureau open, and then his eyes were perfectly dazzled with the amount of jewelry and trinkets of all kinds and descriptions that were exhibited to his gaze. There was a great number of watches, gold chains, silver and gold snuff-boxes, and a large assortment of rings, shoe-buckles, and brooches. Those articles must have been of great value, and Tobais could not help exclaiming aloud, "How could Sweeny Todd come by these articles, except by the murder of their owners?" This indeed seemed but too probable a supposition, and the more especially so, as in a further part of this bureau a great quantity of apparel was found by Tobais. He stood with a candle in his hand, looking upon these various objects for more than a quarter of an hour, and then, as a sudden and natural thought came across him of how completely a few of them even would satisfy his wants and his mother's for a long time to come, he stretched forth his hand toward the glittering mass, but he drew it back again with a shudder, saying, "No, no, these things are the plunder of the dead. Let Sweeny Todd keep them to himself, and look upon them if he can, with eyes of enjoyment. I will have none of them. They would bring misfortune, along with every guinea that they might be turned into." As he spoke, he heard St. Dunstan's clock strike 9, and he started at the sound, for it let him know that already Sweeny Todd had been away an hour beyond the time he said he would be absent, so that there was a probability of his quick return now, and it would scarcely be safe to linger longer in this house. "I must be gone. I must be gone. I should like to look upon my mother's face once more before I leave London forever, perhaps. I might tell her of the danger she is in from Todd's knowledge of her secret. No, no, I cannot speak to her of that. I must go, and leave her to those chances which I hope and trust will work favourably for her." It was a strange and sudden whim that took him, rather than a matter of reflection that induced him, instead of his own hat, to take one of those which were laying so indiscriminately at his feet, and he did so. By mere accident, it turned out to be an exceedingly handsome hat, of rich workmanship and material. And then, Tobais, feeling terrified lest Sweeny Todd should return before he could leave the place, paid no attention to anything, but turned from the shop, merely pulling the door after him, and then darting over the road toward the temple like a hunted hare, for his great wish was to see his mother, and then he had an undefined notion that his best plan for escaping the clutches of Sweeny Todd would be to go to sea. In common with all boys of his age, who know nothing whatever of the life of a sailor, it presented itself in the most fascinating colours. A sailor ashore and a sailor afloat are about as 2 different things as the world can present. But to the imagination of Tobais Ragg, a sailor was somebody who was always dancing hornpipes, spending money, and telling wonderful stories. No wonder, then, that the profession presented itself under such fascinating colours to all such persons as Tobais. And as it seemed, and still seems, to be a sort of general understanding that the real condition of a sailor should be mystified in every possible way and shape by both novelist and dramatist, it is no wonder that it requires actual experience to enable those parties who are in the habit of being carried away by just what they hear to come to a correct conclusion. "I will go to sea," ejaculated Tobais. "Yes, I'll go to sea." As he spoke these words, he passed out of the gate of the temple leading into Whitefriars, in which ancient vicinity his mother dwelt, endeavouring to eke out a living as best she might. She was very much surprised, for she happened to be at home, at the unexpected visit of her son, Tobais, and uttered a faint scream as she let fall a flat iron very nearly upon his toes. "Mother," he said, "I cannot stay with Sweeny Todd any longer, so do not ask me." "Not stay with such a respectable man?" "A respectable man? Mother! Alas, alas, how little you know of him! But what am I saying? I dare not speak. Oh, that fatal, fatal candlestick!" "But how are you going to live? Of what do you mean by a fatal candlestick?" "Forgive me. I did not mean to say that. Farewell, mother. I'm going to sea." "To see what, my dear?" said Mrs. Ragg, who was much more difficult to talk to than even Hamlet's gravedigger. "You don't know how much I am obliged to Sweeny Todd." "Yes, I do, and that's what drives me mad to think of. Farewell, mother, perhaps forever. If I can, of course, I will communicate with you, but now I dare not stay." "Oh, what have you done, Tobais? What have you done?" "Nothing, nothing. But Sweeny Todd is—" "What? No matter, nothing. And yet, at this last moment, I am almost tempted to ask you concerning a candlestick." "Don't mention that," said Mrs. Ragg. "I don't want to hear anything said about it." "It is true, then?" "Yes, but did Mr. Todd tell you?" He did. I have now asked the question I never thought could have passed my lips. Farewell, mother, forever farewell." Tobais rushed out of the place, leaving old Mrs. Ragg astonished at his behaviour, and with a strong suspicion that some accession of insanity had come over him. "The Lord have mercy upon us," she said. "What shall I do? I am astonished at Mr. Todd telling him about the candlestick. It's true enough, though, for all that. I recollect it well, as though it were yesterday. It was a very hard winter, and I was minding a set of chambers when Todd came to shave the gentleman, and I saw him with my own eyes put a silver candlestick in his pocket. Then I went over to his shop and reasoned with him about it, and he gave it me back again, and I brought it to the chambers and laid it down exactly on the spot where he took it from." "To be sure," said Mrs. Ragg, after a pause of only a few moments, "to be sure he has been a very good friend to me ever since. But that, I suppose, is for fear I should tell, and get him hung or transported. But however, we must take the good with the bad, and when Tobais comes to think of it, he will go back again to his work. I dare say, for after all, it's a very foolish thing for him to trouble his head whether Mr. Todd stole a silver candlestick or not." And that is where we are going to leave it for today. If you like what I'm doing here on my channel, please like, subscribe, hit the bell, do the thing. Share me with all your friends, get me out there. And otherwise, I'll be seeing you guys next time. Bye!